Good morning, everyone. You are listening to 91.7 The Edge WSUW Whitewater. This is your host of the Farms Radio Show, Ken. And today we have a very special guest, Professor Margarita Alario of the Environmental Sociology Department. So, we got a lot to talk about today. Professor here, she is experienced, as you might guess, with a lot of environmental sociology. So, Professor, thank you for coming on to the show today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very grateful to be here, and thanks to you.
Well, thank you very much. So, there's going to be all sorts of topics we're going to talk about today, mostly to do with the land and environment, something that our regular listeners to the show know, something we talk about a lot. But first, before that, we just want to get to know you a little bit more. So first, tell me a bit about yourself. And what I mean by that is tell me about where you grew up and how you started your path and your milestones to where you are today as a career.
Okay. Let me answer by saying that you want me to know how I developed my environmental sociological
Yeah, you can tell a little bit about yourself,
Okay.
any little milestones in your life that you think are relevant.
Sure. Well, this answer might surprise you just a tiny bit.
Alrighty.
I was a PhD student, political sociology, in New York City.
Oh, really?
Massive urban construction city site. And as I was, a student getting my PhD, something clicked. Mm-hmm. And what clicked was the amount of waste, consumption, energy uses, right, in the city. And slowly but surely, all my political, sociological determination began to shift towards environmental sociology, which is an irony to discover the natural environment and its fragility in a city like New York City. It surprised me. It surprised my advisors. It surprised my fellow students that I became such an adamant environmental sociologist.
If I might interrupt you, what led you to this point? Like, was there certain people in your life? Was there certain articles you read or just events you stumbled across?
Well, there were multiple things happening in the city of New York, particularly in Harlem. There was this very small, but certainly the tendency was growing in relationship to environmental justice, right? Harlem, the Bronx, predominantly at the time, poor African American New Yorkers, and there were some toxic sites being proposed. So I became quite aware of the situation, and that intrigued me. Another historical event that just blew my mind was in the April 26th. Imagine, I remember, April 26, 1986, Chernobyl nuclear explosion. I became very aware of the negative impact. I became very aware of the distinctive possibility of a technology that has been sold as 99.99999% safe. And to this day, the site, Chernobyl, it still is a contaminated area, a place where many biologists and other social scientists are still studying. Just for the record, this is in the context of the Cold War. Chernobyl is today located in Ukraine. At the time, it was the Soviet Union. So you can imagine She can imagine the awareness that woke up in someone just becoming to an understanding of how important environmental issues are.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I've actually been researching into Chernobyl myself recently for one of my other courses.
Oh,
And yeah, for the people that, for our audience listeners that aren't aware of, when you're saying how it's radioactive there, Chernobyl is the best possible example of the worst case scenario of handling this
Sure.
nuclear energy.
Sure.
It was handled horribly, and the cleanup crew, the sarcophaguses put in the nuclear site to contain the radiation is below par, to say the least. And the half-life, or in other words, the amount of time that they'll stay radioactive will be probably a couple 100,000 years that'll have to be managed.
Precisely.
So I definitely see your point on
Yes.
that.
And if we want to talk a bit more about that, today we will also have to talk about Fukushima Daiichi in Japan, which is, well, we still have to see the results, but it is still a tragedy.
Yeah, it's still existing.
Unfolding, right.
Yeah, why don't we bring that up once we get more into the climate change area of this discussion. I think that'll be a very, very relevant discussion point too.
Sure.
So getting involved with all this, it sounds like you certainly kept yourself busy and involved, especially in the New York area.
Yes.
So leading up to that, did you do any more post-studies after this, or any certain kinds of involvement with yourself prior to leading up to your career as a professor?
Well, when you are a PhD student, that's all you do. It's 24/7. Yeah, the rigors and the demands of PhD students are such that is all you do. Study, continue to study, attend the seminar.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And maybe sleep a bit later on Sundays. It truly is very demanding.
Yeah, I've talked with a couple, I'm a public relations major myself, so I can't relate to that lifestyle. But I have friends and other peers that do, and they're the kind of people that when you hear from them, you hear from them. And that's just kind of the reality of being a PhD student.
Yes, so. And remember, I am discovering a new field.
Yeah.
So it was as fascinating as it was demanding, because when it came to environmental studies, I was beginning as a PhD student from scratch, right? So the demands were double, if not triple, right?
Yeah, most certainly. So how did that end up leading up to you at Whitewater here? Like Whitewater compared to New York, which is actually funny because lead professor for the Farms Project here, he's from New York area, or he's from Ohio, but he lived in New York for a while too, like yourself, and he ended up here. So how did you end up making your way towards Wisconsin?
Well, it's a long story, and remember, from New York to Whitewater, there are about 24 years. I have been teaching that much, yes. Yes. I'm getting up there. And so as I am writing my dissertation, by the way, the intention was never to stay, at least not so obvious, to stay in the States. I was born in South America, in Colombia to be precise, in a beautiful city called Cartagena, which is coastal, is Caribbean. So ending up in the north, it was not part of the plan, right? As I am writing my dissertation, State University of New York at Potsdam made me an offer, assistant professor. So why not? I talked to my advisors, and they are saying, absolutely. I mean, how wonderful it is. You teach, and while you teach, write your dissertation. I had begun the dissertation, but certainly I had at least another year to go before it could truly be presented to the committee. So their advice is, sure, go, begin an experience as an assistant professor, continue your dissertation, come back in a year, you will have a PhD, then make the decision.
Oh, that's very interesting.
And the decision is, well, I'll stay, I'll go up in the tenure track of SUNY Potsdam. 4 years, I had more desire to do more research-oriented work, right? So, again, the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign made me an offer, and I was an environmental social sciences research specialist. So I really concentrated on much more research, much more less teaching, right?
Okay.
I had a contract, 8 years, 8 very intense research years, but I did not have the security of tenure, which is what the University of Wisconsin in Whitewater offered. And that attracted me. And in the process of going through the whole tenure track demands, I think I have reached a nice balance between teaching and research that this institution has allowed me to.
Fantastic to hear. Why don't we talk more about that? So to break it down to two parts, two of your work as a professor here and your work as a researcher here and any other organizations, clubs, etc. that you might manage. So first, tell me about some of the courses you teach here or some of the courses you might have taught in the past, and then we can segue that into some of the research that you do.
Well, because you are in one of my classes, you know that I do sociology of natural disasters. And just so everyone gets a sense of what it is, we study in depth Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, 2005, and the impact, the social impact that it left behind. I teach environmental sociology, which is an introduction to environmental problems, those that have been humanly caused, right? So the focus is on the activities of social systems that lead to certain amount of environmental destruction as well as negative impacts to communities, essentially. I am proposing, as we speak, a special course on food security, and that is an issue that very important for the state of Wisconsin. Ironically so, because this is such a
it's an agriculture-based state.
Right, and so it is. And more so than that, is particularly relevant for the University of Wisconsin system students, right? What else have I taught? Adventure into globalization from the perspective of the environment again. So, in short, the focus is on environment from whichever perspective I have taught it. And the changes to the classes, of course, according to the demands of a curriculum, have to change somewhat. But given my specialization as an environmental sociologist, invariably I end up with the natural environment and humans in this landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of putting it about too, because I know to catch you up to some of the prior discussions we've had on this show before was talking about the environment, but from more of the geographical, geology, and scientific standpoint. So, but one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, I know I've been educated in your course on natural disasters, is from the sociological standpoint of it. And one of the most interesting things I've taken away so far was the World Bank disaster relief program. Some of the process, like to make sense of what that means to our audience. It's basically discusses about the steps between how to deal with disasters or natural disasters, and put timestamps on those areas as well too. such as things like bringing in food, bringing in relief, future prevention, and some of them can last just for like the first month approximately for the immediate relief, and then some of them will extend much more into the continuous future. So with that being said to it, there's a lot of interesting standpoints that can go along with the scientific evidence of climate change and loss of land, and just how we as humans can deal with that. And it's like you just said too, how humans and food should relate to each other in our modern lifestyles too. Mm-hmm. So I think this would be a great way to segue into our main conversation piece of a sociological look at the land and the environment. So we'll start off with the land portion of that too. Earlier in our preliminary interview, you were talking to me about the loss of land in America, and as you brought before, Katrina had a huge role in that too, as not a way of what Katrina did, but of all the things that I'm more getting at New Orleans and Louisiana here. Yes, we discussed prior about exactly why Katrina was so devastating to that area too. I think you could give our audience here a perfect example of using Katrina in New Orleans, and then we can talk about other examples too, of course.
Yes, the story goes something like this, Ken. So a colleague of mine and I visited New Orleans for the 10-year anniversary of Katrina. And so that was in 2015.
Okay.
We stayed in New Orleans. We visited the zones. We essentially witnessed what has been done, what new developments have happened, which areas have been left behind, as if Katrina had just happened yesterday. And we also did something quite interesting. We went to a city close to New Orleans called Houma.
Okay.
There we met colleagues. And in this, talking to colleagues, they said, oh, it would be so very important and interesting for you if you visited the Ile de Saint Charles. The Ile de Saint Charles is a tiny little strip of land that where indigenous groups have lived for millennia, right? The problem is that the land is disappearing and they have to relocate. And the urgency is such that the HUD, the House and Urban Development Department, gave them a $50 million grant for them to start exploring where else to go, right? And perhaps more important or more interesting than that, the federal government recognized them as climate change refugees. They have the status of climate change refugees, right? Mm-hmm. Indigenous people in the United States, in the state of Louisiana, climate change refugees, right? That's something associated with the South Pacific Islands, right? But in the States. So that for me was quite revealing. We visited last August again, so twice in a row. We got wonderful grant from UWW. And we visited Ile de Saint Charles again. And by now they know us, so they were even friendlier. So they gave us another tour, and they physically show us how much land has been retreated. And essentially they have to move shortly, right? There is not much more time. And the question is, where are they going to go? And this is not just one family relocating. This is a whole community, right? Louisiana is losing the size of soccer field every 45 minutes. The land is disappearing. Water is encroaching. Sea levels are rising. The natural defenses have been destroyed. We talk about natural disaster, but we also have to think in New Orleans and that region is the accumulative effect of natural disasters, including BP, the oil spill. So what you have is layers and layers of disaster, right? So even if you solve Katrina, then oops, here we go, hit again.
Yeah.
And so it's a complex issue. And so I have become alert to this particular problem of the climate change refugees. The loss of land is an issue of interest. I just wish I had more time to do more research.
Yeah, certainly. I understand your concern for it too, because I know that pretty much all the country and most of the world maybe even is quite aware of the disaster on New Orleans that was Katrina. So, but a lot of people don't understand how it got to be so bad, especially when hurricanes of equal power in the past, back in the late 60s and 70s, hit the area as well, but you didn't see the same amount of flooding and damage, and how just how we got to that point too. So it's a very interesting thing to think about of how it gets to this point, and if there is another hurricane in the future, what kind of damage will it do? Because as you mentioned before, and I wasn't aware of this, that Katrina, by the damage, you'd think it went straight to the middle of the city. It went about 60 miles east of the city too, off the tip of Louisiana.
Technically, it missed.
Okay.
Katrina missed, technically.
Yeah.
But, of course, 60 miles is not so far.
Yeah.
Technically, it missed it.
Yeah, which is a very alarming. So if a hurricane does hit the city in the future, how can New Orleans even survive that? So some of the stuff I'd like you to go more in depth about too is how, because we understand a lot of climate change effects, like you said too, of the location of southern Louisiana, being on silt land, and how it's not meant to have a lot of buildings there, and just with the slowly rising sea levels too. But how did it get to be so bad in an area like New Orleans, and how can that relate to maybe some other areas in the country or in the world?
Yeah. Well, let's also remember that there were some technological failures, right? And the levees essentially gave up. So the city was left unprotected. According to the multiple studies that I have come across, those levees were built and rebuilt in the 60s to stand Category 3, hurricane Category 3. They go from 0 to 5. 5 is the max. So they were built to stand Category 3, and yet they gave up to a hurricane that didn't really hit the city. So one has to wonder in what conditions, one has to wonder what kind of preparedness there was. And you and I know that hurricanes are not going away from that that area, right? I mean, they are not.
Yeah, it's nothing that's going to be going away anytime soon or ever.
Right. And we cannot dictate the trajectory of hurricanes. So, but from the sociological point of view, one has to wonder how prepared were they really? I mean, and we are talking about technology, we are talking about institutional responses, we're talking about responsible political institutions that take their job quite seriously in protecting and representing their constituencies. So there are multiple areas that you and I could go into, as we have done in the class. I because you're asking me questions that we have discussed time. So I
would say that some of the areas that come to my mind for categories of the sociological side is just So excluding the climate part of it, of New Orleans itself, you can look at it from a financial, political, and technological standpoint too.
Absolutely.
So like technology maybe being the durability and the quality of the levees or any structures provided,
The flood walls.
or even just other substitutes that might be more efficient. And then from a financial and political side, such as groups like FEMA or just the larger political bodies that are out of state or in state, depending on the example, and what role they play in and how effective they were in Katrina, and if they weren't effective for these case studies, what could be fixed for them in the future too. So we could take each of those three areas, or if there's any other categories besides the technology, political, and financial that you want to address as well.
No, those are good categories, and the fact that we are talking about a disaster, well, let's call it a natural hazard. It was a social disaster, a political disaster, an economic disaster, an environmental, certainly not a natural. So, sure, these natural hazards are quite challenging, and they are challenging because they are so complex, right? You mentioned it. Financially, they are challenging. Politically, they are challenging. From the social impact, community impact, they are quite challenging. One of the reasons why in this class, as you have, as you know, we focus on Katrina is that just about everything that could go wrong went wrong. And when that happens, very unfortunate for the communities, what it opens to us, academic researchers, is a field of study to really understand how an event could go so very wrong and what are the steps, corrective steps, that can prevent those future potentially destructive natural hazards. So by using Katrina and the destructiveness and the mismanagement, the failure, we can also learn, and that is one of the pedagogical tools. Learn from past mistakes, essentially, and that's what we're doing.
Alrighty then. Yeah, it's definitely the key points to this too. It's just the how to react to these situations and identifying the issues, because it could be easy to dismiss of, well, that's just the destructive power of a hurricane, to attribute to everything that happened with Katrina and specifically in New Orleans. But when you look at the causation of it, it's so much more different. And some of the correlations might be confused too with the individuals that look at it from a glance. So I think it's interesting to see how some of the approaches were with Katrina and maybe some other disasters too that might have happened in the country too. Like I know we discussed before the Dust Bowl, how that came to be, and how the Dust Bowl was so much worse, not just because of the actual Dust Bowl, like the actual dust storms in the Dust Bowl, but also from the Depression and how it was a slow, stagnant, but eventually very lethal hit onto the farmers of the Oklahoma and surrounding regions. So when you, I guess my question now that I'd like to discuss is, when you look at it from, say, a recovery standpoint, from, let's just say, a governmental federal side, because that's just how our country is set up, is from a federal standpoint, where it tries to combine the national and the state funding and support. How do you see that? And you can use Louisiana or any other state or disaster as an example here, but how do you see how that's developed in, let's say, the past 100 years in modern day United States, with some of the disasters you've researched into?
Well, I mean, the federal government has an incredible capacity, right? And an incredible, well-developed technology and institutions, scientists. I mean, an agency like NOAA is remarkable. And in fact, it's the agency that so very well predicted the trajectory of Sandy. And hence, because the science and the technology was right in place, and the politics, right? Sandy could have been much more devastating, and it was not. It was a relatively well managed one. So there is the capacity, the technology. Certainly, this is the wealthiest economy.
Mm-hmm.
So the finances are there. When the politics gets in the middle of the science doing its job and the technology working as it is, then you can have truly a disasters. And I think Katrina is a good example of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Everything that could go wrong went wrong. Perhaps with few exceptions, like the coastal guards were fabulous, and citizens, the so-called Cajun flotilla, were wonderful, which also tells you about the resilience of the civil society of this country. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people coming together to help one another in
Mm-hmm.
disasters. So yes, the federal government has a whole set of well-developed institutions to do so. One of the problems with a federal government, like all federal governments, is that the policy approach is incrementalist,
Mm-hmm.
step by step, not comprehensive. The policy approach is reactive, not proactive.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is no investment in preventive measures. There is a lot of money going into the risk management and disaster management. So it is what it is. It is the approach. We can spend the rest of this interview evaluating it in terms of political structures.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we have to work with.
Yeah, and it sounds like maybe some of the potential errors with that system are, well, actually, let me just touch on the positives. First could be that at least when disasters happen, if
Yes.
all is planned accordingly, we know exactly how to react and when
Yep.
to react, and that can help a lot of people. But as you said, too, with the incremental system, and you can even use the United States versus Netherlands example, too, that we discussed prior about that, of what the differences of that might seem in a case study example too. So, would you care to discuss more about using the flooding example of Netherlands versus United States and how their
Well,
system differs from ours?
It's a totally different system, right? And the skills are different. The Netherlands is the size of New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps we could compare New Jersey with the
That might
Dutch.
be more appropriate.
Different systems. It would take us into a different discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we come back.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, most certainly, because the thing about the United States, and I understand why I started with, because it is so massive, and each state might as well be like a country in Europe too, because there's so many different processes for each state, and some of them, when they face something that from a climate or environmental side might be equally devastating in their own respect. Like, let's say you have two hurricanes that hit somewhere in the northeast coast versus like a southern coast. The southern coast might be, because of this policy, this as a thought experiment, could be a lot more devastated than the northeast coast, even if the hurricanes were to strike similar locations with the same amount of ferocity. So there's a lot of interesting ways to view that too, about just how each of our states react to the situations they're put into. And I think that might be an interesting way to talk more about the food in Wisconsin.
Okay.
Like you were mentioning before too, about how Wisconsin, you said, was having, I believe, a food struggle.
Well, no, not Wisconsin. Let me rephrase. I am in the midst of proposing this course, which takes a global perspective on the increasing or the growing problem of food insecurity in the world. Right? And the course proposal is to end up taking on Wisconsin. In the process of doing that, proposing that seminar, I came across an interesting sociological study by a former professor from UW-Madison, a sociologist. And the title of her book is Paying the Price. It truly is about students struggling with the increasing tuition, right? And how they have to now, before there were grants, the Pell Grants, students could devote their time just to study. Now, many students have to study, have to work, and so on and so forth. One of the intriguing waking up chapters for me was the title, Groceries or Graduation? Why am I bringing that up? Well, in this study, I forget her. It's a very complex name, but this sociologist, this colleague, brings the issue and well-researched, very well-researched, the fact that some students have to really choose whether they are going to save to pay the tuition or buy groceries for the week. That has led to an increasing number of food insecure students in the UW system, not just Whitewater, not Madison, the entire system. That is an area that I am beginning to explore. I'm not an expert, just scratching it to the surface. I thought it would be relevant for students for environmental studies students, sociology, economics, environmental sciences, and so on and so forth, to be exposed to that growing problematic, right? So we think of food insecurity and with the images of these poor kids in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and it breaks our heart when we see that is in our backyard. And we need to be aware, because in the absence of awareness, we don't know that we need to address the issue. That's what I'm doing.
Okay. And well, first of all, as a student, I can definitely relate to your conversation piece there, because, well, this semester is my last semester here, and I only had 12 credits compared to the 16 or 18 I normally take. Still working, then doing all the courses. I usually try to keep a food budget of about like $40 a week. And so I'm basically confined to places like Walmart Supercenters just to do my food shopping, because on the other locations, such as really just any other more higher quality, I guess you could say, food stores, I just can't afford to shop there.
Organic?
Yeah, no. So I mean, like, I'll grow my own stuff at home too, and I can still make pretty good meals from what's available at locations like Walmart, but it is quite a limiting factor, and I intend to increase my positive a better diet after graduation here, once I can get more of a full-time entry position. So with your research on this and applying the knowledge we've learned before, is there, like, I know this is an in-process thing that's going on.
Yes.
But is there any potential solutions you or other colleagues are suggesting with this, or trying to research more into to see if there could be a potential fixing problem? Because the way I see is that with the increase of tuition, as you mentioned, there's going to be more students that can't afford food, let alone other, like maybe entertainment or any other financial investments. So how can at least the food problem be resolved, or have you heard any suggestions or proposals on that yet?
No. What is certainly, well, no and yes. In fact, as of this summer, a colleague of mine and I are going to be partnering with communities partners, the Angelic Organic Farms, and they have a wonderful work on sustainability and organic farming near our campus and in Rockford, and they are focusing on youth threatened by food insecurity, and teaching them how to create urban gardens, a source of food. That is the small scale positive answer that I can give you. The larger picture, I mean, if students have to choose between graduating or groceries, I'm afraid that increasing their tuition is not going to help, and I don't see any decrease of tuition anytime soon. I just don't. Yes, I think students are going to be increasingly placed in that position to choose an either or.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting scenario too, and I can understand like maybe having certain luxuries available while you're attending college, and like I'm not like asking for free tuition. I mean, I don't mind paying, but there's a certain reasonableness when it comes to paying too, especially if you account for certain factors such as inflation between different generations that attended the same schools. And so like I know that if I expect something to be more luxurious to me, like maybe higher quality food, or even somewhere that I'm living on campus, I work extra hours for that. But then it comes down to the level of the basic necessities of just food in general. I'm sure most people that are struggling with this aren't requesting to go out to like a 4-star restaurant or even getting fast food every night, but they just want to be able to purchase groceries at a reasonable price that are just healthy enough for them too.
Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm. No, not big demands, right?
No.
It's not big. It's not big.
Yeah. So we have about 30 minutes left for discussion. I'd like to just talk more about climate change before we start to wrap things up too. So I know we talked about Katrina as an example too. So whether it's from our course or just any other examples in either the United States or outside of it, is there any other interesting case studies on the effects of climate change in sociology?
Well, then let's address that, because hurricanes are natural events, right? Climate change, certainly.
Yeah.
we cannot say, oh, climate change is the cause. What, with an increasing amount of certainty, we can say, and I am using secondary data from climatologists. I have to rely, as an environmental sociologist, I rely on these kinds of colleagues to provide me with secondary data that helps me understand the humanly induced, right, natural disasters, disasters, not natural, disasters and environmental risks, and then wrap it up. So let's be clear. What these climatologists are telling us is that, and oceanographers and so on, are telling us is that don't blame hurricanes on climate change. Those are natural events. Well, the increasing correlation is the strength, the force, the frequency of these destructive and extreme events. So they are finding some correlation with hurricanes, certainly. That is, and again, because we are within the realms of the sciences and the methods, we have to be very cautious. They are increasingly finding the probabilities, and they are finding, I want to be very careful because this is all a methodological discussion that I don't want to bore people, but with increasing amount of certainty.
Yeah.
They are saying, yes, we do see a correlation of the anthropogenic, human-induced climatic changes and extreme events. Someone by the name of Michael Mann, who professor, climatologist, professor, Penn State University, and author of The Hockey Stick Goes to Washington, a wonderful, wonderful book on climate change. Recently at a radio interview was saying that indeed the models that are coming up are showing with great certainty that yes, we are in trouble. We are in trouble.
Yeah, I think that the most interesting point you brought up too is how distinguishing between disasters and natural disasters, and you can correct me this if you think that your definition would be different, but the way I would interpret what you mean by that is how a natural disaster is something that might be unforeseen or a naturally occurring event that shouldn't be normalized, but if it happens, it happens. And where a disaster, such as the case with the affected New Orleans from Katrina, is something that is a result of incompetency from the human side of to considering its environment and its location and other factors that relate to that too. So to give like an example of maybe me building a home out in Kansas, and then once every 20 years there could be a chance of a devastating tornado coming in. I would consider that more of a natural disaster because it's not as often occurring, or it's something I can only prepare myself for. But building my home in the middle of a sand dune and then having like a month later it being devastated just because of the climate of the area, that's something that'd just be a disaster. I don't think people call that a natural disaster because like, what do you expect? So with New Orleans and just how we've handled it too, and maybe even, I guess from my standpoint, once again, correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, is it can be almost blurred between the lines of natural and disaster and a regular disaster too, such as with New Orleans, that if we, let's say, had a technological and financial system that was more preventative of any major events occurring, then if something did occur, it might just be because of the power of the hurricane. That might be more of a rarity for that hurricane, and not just because it was a hurricane that happened to happen in the area.
Yeah, Ken, and if we were more preventative, then we would be very aggressive addressing issues of climate change.
Yeah, and that is the very unfortunate thing about climate change is regardless of, like I know from mine, I've seen enough evidence to support like an anthropomorphic effect on climate change, in other words, about how humans have caused
impacted
climate change. And whether you want to go into the whole global warming discussion, that's just a part of climate change. It's not climate change in itself. Climate change is simply, like climate quickly defined here, is just the long-term effects of weather over the course of X amount of period of time. And we can study the past history of that too using different methods of geology. But with the climate change itself, what that means then is just the longer term effects of how climate is changing. And if there's noticeable differences, doesn't mean that, as the best way I can put it is from Professor Bhattacharya, who was one of my first guests on the show. We talked about climate change, and she defined it as more of, it's not that climate change won't ever happen, or that we are causing it to happen as if it never did in the past, but it's more of how we're accelerating it, or how we just simply play a role. Like, it doesn't have to be always bad either. There might be unforeseen positives from it. But the examples from cases like Katrina and stuff like that too, those are negative examples of climate change. And that's something that should be addressed. But that's something that whether people are just ignorant of the evidence that exists, or people that are just unaware of how to fix it, from a governmental political standpoint, it can seem overwhelming of how to deal with this. Like I know the discussion we had in class too of how maybe an agency like FEMA says, oh wait, okay, we can take care of these things, we need funds, and the government says, well, we don't have the funds for this, we're putting funds into these things, and they send us, well, you get it from these guys, and like, well, they're not giving us that money, and then it's just like this long term of who owes what to who, and so everyone has the potential to fix the issue, but it's the discussion. I mean, I guess you could say that's maybe like a nature of a improperly used politics, but that seems to be the result of what's happening for some of these more disasters, not natural disasters. And that's how you get cases like New Orleans, where it's a city that's been devastated that didn't need to be as damaged nearly as much as it did, let alone the long-term after effects that we're still seeing to this day with things like poverty and the street damage.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad to hear you analyze it that way. I mean, the class have been... this sociology of natural disaster has been quite successfully just listening to you.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that.
Compliments. Yeah, it's. I found one of the most useful ways for addressing this too was to take it from a sociological standpoint and the scientific standpoint. The scientific standpoint can help people predict what will happen, what is quote unquote normal and not normal for a certain region, and what is changing, what might become the new norm. As the Earth's climate has always changed. Once again, the climate, it's always changed, always had very damaging effects and very positive effects in the past, but it's just how humans play a role into that now with our modern industrialized existence here on this planet. And that's all the scientific stuff. For our listeners, you can research into that stuff. I listen to our pastor and used to learn more about that, the evidence with that and how it changes. But when it comes to the social, I think that the sociological is like a result of now knowing the scientific side of things. Like scientific will say this is what's going to happen. Sociological will say us as humans now, this is how we should react because of these predicted changes. And I think that in order to create a better future for preventing disasters or natural disasters, we can just use the scientific knowledge we know and then apply it to sociology, and then that can help us predict about what measures we could take for certain areas too. So I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on that too.
Well, I don't think that whether natural or social sciences are the problem, right? I mean, we study, we are a factory of knowledge. That's what we can provide. The decision makers are the ones that make the decisions, right? So, you do the research, you show your work, you show your evidences. Here is the analysis. Here is, here is the lessons from past events. If we continue on this course, there are no reasons to believe that we will not, right? And let's be careful with the predictability because, I tend to be very empirical, very data-driven. So yes, and again, in defense of all the natural and social scientists, we do what we have been trained to do, which is do good research. Hey, here are the evidences. Climate change is having an impact. Yes, it's humanly induced. We have altered the climate and in a geologically insignificant amount of time. I mean, let's not remember that the Holocene, the geological era that we are supposed to be in still, has lasted some 12,000 years. And it is post-World War II, well, if we go a bit before, since the Industrial Revolution, that we began to accelerate the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, which then has changed the climate. And again, in a geologically insignificant amount of time. Right? And it is all human activity, right? And the great acceleration is post-World War II, and so on and so forth. So we can go back into the history and that. But again, as social and natural scientists, our job, and well done, is to provide the foundations, the research, the awareness, the teaching. I have not been elected a politician. It's not up to me to make the decisions. I mean, I go and vote, and I trust that whomever represents me will do the right thing, right? So I mean, in defense of the research community, of which of course I'm part, and I have to be proud of it. And I am. We're doing what we can in terms of awareness, in terms of education. So, I mean, listen to you give all these explanations from just taking one sociology of natural disasters class. So
and even my takeaway too from a lot of this too is using Katrina, because that's been our primary case study. This whole discussion is that even if you just learn about one or two case studies, that's the point of a case study. You could. For all I care, the person that I might, or that you might be listening to might not even care about Katrina stuff or never even heard of it. But what they take away of learning about how this occurred, that can help for so many future instances.
Precisely.
That's why things like history are useful. So,
precisely.
I think that's definitely the key takeaway. And I guess in an ideal world for the United States, that we could have more people that could communicate this information to their political leaders or just voice their opinions on this too. And that those messages could be easier distributed among, say, going from the scientific to the sociological to the political industries, and that will lead to just better preventions in the future too, if done correctly.
Yes.
So, I guess for our last part of our discussion here, is there any last takeaways, whether it's on Katrina or just some of the concepts we've been talking about that you'd like our audience to learn from?
Well, one thing that I keep telling my students, particularly the ones in intro courses, I say, okay, here is a set of principles, here is data, here are some facts that I can back up. But I also tell them, be skeptical. Don't just, because I'm saying so, don't just go and absorb it in an uncritical way. So for anyone that is standing, that is listening, go find out about climate change. Yeah. Don't go and educate yourself about climate change and see what outcomes, what facts, what data, what learning, what awareness you come out of it. And so more than just let's engage into yet another topic, environmental topic, let me go back to my teaching role and say, as I say to all the students, go do your homework and see if we overlap in the facts, in the data, because chances are we are. Yeah. And you will find the incredible amount of evidence about the humanly induced environmental destruction, right? Going back to Chernobyl, going back, my goodness, going back to waste, going back to toxics, going back to emissions, going back to CO2 emissions, climate change. Start your research.
Yeah, I think that's the best way going about it too. It's a wonderful way of thinking about this, is that it's not like it's part of any agenda or anything like that too. It's all you're doing, and what I'm really trying to do is say this is what we've observed, and this is the reality of the situations we are in, or predicting the situations we might be in the future. Yep. And if you have a reason to disbelieve us on any of the claims, then just show the evidence, and anyone that's reasonable will definitely take your word for it and then do their own research too. That's the wonderful thing about research, is that it's not trying to fulfill a goal. All it's doing is trying to predict the reality of
and understand
the natural environment.
Right.
That's all it is.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So, and the more you can learn about that, the more you can help make things better.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for coming on to the show today. I think it's been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. Well, it'll be exciting to talk with you in the future about any future endeavors you might have in your future research. So,
thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for listening today. You're listening to 91.7 The Edge, WSUW Whitewater. This has been the Farms Radio Show. Your host, Ken, here. For the Farms Radio Show is brought to you by the Wisconsin Farms Oral History Project. If you're a farmer and you have a story, let us know, and we will tell it to the world for all to hear. So, and if you want to learn more information, you can check us out at wisconsinfarms.org or on our Facebook page at Wisconsin Farms Oral History Project. Till then, y'all have a great day.